Hello folks, welcome to Skillshare.com. In today's video, we are going to take a look at Nutanix Objects Deployment and some of the prerequisites that we need to take care prior to the deployment. We will also try to understand each of these prerequisites and how does it really impacts the deployment. We will also try to understand what all options that we get during the deployment and how each of these options really impacts your overall deployment and what really happens behind the screen when the deployment is in progress. Let's log into Prism Central server. This is a typical dashboard giving high-level stats across all the PE clusters attached in this PC. Quick look at the Prism Central management interface. Now you can see here this is scale out PC. It's a 3-node PC deployed on one of the Prism element cluster attached to this Prism Central server. Let's go back to the main dashboard and we can take a look at one of the Prism element cluster that we'll be using for the objects deployment. So this is a typical 3-node cluster spread across 2 blocks. Only additional feature I have enabled on this cluster is encryption. This is not a prerequisite for the objects deployment. I just enabled it to safe secure my data. So depending upon your requirement, feel free to enable this feature. I just want to make sure that I take advantages of all the goodness that the underlying AOS cluster is providing me. Let's begin with the actual deployment. Go to the services section. Under services, you should see objects option. This is the objects UI. By default, the service is not enabled. You should actually find enable button here. Once you hit enable, we start 2 services in the Prism Central. One is the objects manager service and the second one is the MSP controller. Both of these services are very critical for deployment and administration of your objects cluster. Once the service is enabled, the first thing that we should do is make sure that your object service is on the latest release. All the object lifecycle management is taken care by the LCM service. So let's go to the LCM UI and click on perform inventory. Inventory operation will query Nutanix portal and it will actually give you an option to upgrade your objects manager MSP service, or if you already have objects deployed, it will actually give you an option to upgrade your objects cluster as well. All the available upgrades will be listed under the software tab. In my case, I already have upgraded Objects Manager and MSP Controller service to the latest. As you could see here, my Objects Manager is on 2.2 release and MSP service so on 107 release. Let's go back to the Objects UI and begin with the actual deployment. The first screen talks about the prerequisite that we need to take care prior to the deployment. Now, all of these prerequisites are explained in detail in the user guide. So I would highly recommend you to go through the objects user guide. Where to find the user guide? Let's go to the Nutanix portal under the documentation section. You should find data services and click on the objects user guide here. So first section talks about a bit of an overview and then the usage, and then there is the licensing information. And this is a section it talks about the prerequisite, and as you could see, it has got quite a lot detail here. Now coming back to the Prism Central. Now let's take a look at how all the requirements look like on my cluster here. So the first requirement says that we need to have a AHV cluster, and the second requirement says that we need to have a DSIP and a virtual IP configured on the AHV cluster. Back to the Prism element server here. Now you could see here this is the AHV cluster, and if I click on the cluster name, I could see here the cluster is configured with the virtual IP as well as the data services IP. So the third requirement talks about we need to have a managed network with at least 12 IPs in the DSCP pool. Let's go to the element again, to the settings and to the network configuration. On my cluster, I have got two network, and I'm actually going to use both the network during the deployment. So you need minimum one network with the 12 IP addresses in the IP pool. Now let's click on the update button here, and you could see here this is pretty much standard information I have provided while creating the network. I have enabled IP management here, provided the network IP and prefix length and the gateway information and also the DNS information. That's it. Let's take a look at the second network. Now, along with the gateway DNS, I have also configured IP pool here. Now, in my case, I have got more than 50 IP addresses because I am using this cluster for other reasons as well. But you need a 12 IP addresses configured here. Cancel and back to the Prism Central server. Fourth point talks about that your Prism Central should be connected to the internet. That is because during the deployment, we query Nutanix portal for downloading the VM image and also deploying the object services. So you need to reach to the Nutanix portal. If this is dark side deployment, then you can actually refer the objects documentation for the dark side deployment workflows. The fifth point is about the DNS and the NTP server. Let's go back to the Prism element. And if you go to the NTP server, you could see here I have got the NTP server configured. If not, please go ahead and configure. And I also have a 2 IP addresses listed under the name server. But the reason we need a name server because during the deployment, the Prism Central needs to reach to the Nutanix portal, and the NTP server is required to make sure that your Prism Central and the Prism element are in sync with each other. In case if you have a firewall enabled on your network, then make sure that you go through the port and URL requirement in the objects guide. So this is a section you can jump to the URL and ports requirement, and it will actually give you all the detailed information about what all ports are required to be opened from your Prism Central service to the Objects VM or Objects VM to the Prism element, or even from Prism Central to the Prism element. Make sure you go through this section and open up all this required port before you initiate the deployment. Let's hit continue. The first screen in the deployment will ask you for the object store name and domain name. If you want to know how to choose your object store name, so you can hover your mouse on the question mark and it will actually give you the guideline for the naming convention. Similarly, for the domain name, you can actually see the guideline for the domain name here. So this is the second screen where you define how big cluster you wanted to deploy. You get three predefined configuration. One is light, medium, and heavy. With the light deployment, we actually deploy a 3-node cluster, whereas medium deployment will deploy 4-node, and a heavy will deploy a 5-node cluster. But if you wanted to deploy, let's say 1-node or 2-node cluster or larger than 5-node cluster, you can just go with the custom option. Now, for every object's VM, we assign 10 vCPUs and 32 gig of memory. So if you want, let's say 2-node cluster, you can click on plus sign, or if you wanted to deploy, let's say 12-node cluster, all I have to do here is just enter 120 vCPUs and this becomes 12-node. So let's go back to the light deployment here. Now, one more thing that you will actually notice here is the moment I selected light node deployment, there's a note appeared here that it says that we are going to use additional 4 vCPUs and 8 gig of memory for the load balancer. During the deployment, Objects deploys load balancer out of the box. So this is a software load balancer. For the 3-node deployment, we deploy 2 load balancer, whereas for the medium deployment, it is going to be 3 load balancer, and for the heavy and above, it will be 4 load balancer. Now you need a multiple load balancer for the high availability as well as achieving the better throughput. The last section in the screen is capacity. Let's mention 10 terabyte. Now this is the logical capacity, which means even if I use entire 10 terabyte, that doesn't mean my writes will start failing. It just means that we will get an alert in your objects cluster, but writes will continue as far as you have space available in your AHV cluster. The third and final screen, where you get an option to choose the AHV cluster for your objects deployment. Let me go ahead and choose the first cluster. Now this is my one node AHV cluster, but if you remember in the previous screen, we have chosen to deploy 3 node cluster. And this is one of the reasons that it is actually giving you a warning message which says that you do not have enough resources in your cluster, and we will just use 10 vCPUs and 32 gig of memory, which means that it will deploy actually just a one node cluster. Let's go back to the second cluster and the warning disappears here. Now there are two more details that you need to provide in this UI. One is the internal access network, the second one is the client access network. Let's choose the network here. Now if you remember in the previous screen, one of the previous screen, that we have seen two network on my PE cluster. Now the prod network had the 12 IP addresses assigned in the IP pool. Select this network. Now the reason that we need 12 IP addresses in this particular network, because this is the network that will be deploying the objects VM, and this network will be used for internal communication of the objects VM and also for communicating to your AHV cluster. And it also asks for two static IP addresses. Now these two static IP addresses will be used for hosting the critical infra services which needs to be up and running all the time in order to achieve the high availability. And the second section is for the client access network, where I could either select the same network or I can actually select the second network here. Now the second network doesn't need to have an IP pool, but you need to have a 4 static IP belonging to the same network. Now these are the 4 IP addresses will be assigned to your load balancer VM, and these are the IP addresses where the object's S3 endpoint will be exposed. Let's hit create button. After you hit the create button, this is where you can actually track the progress of your deployment. If you just hover the mouse on the percentage, it will actually give you the detailed information about all the stages involved in the deployment and at what stage the deployment is. So here during the deployment, we run the bunch of pre-check to make sure that you have a proper cluster, you have an NTP configured, you have a DNS configured, and bunch of other checks before even begin the deployment. The actual first stage in the deployment is deploying the objects cluster. Now this is a stage where we deploy the microservice platform based on the Kubernetes platform uh, and configure this cluster for deploying the object services. So the next section is deploying the Zookeeper. This is the first service that we deploy. The Zookeeper is used for storing the cluster-wide configuration. After the Zookeeper, the next service is Cluster Manager. Now this is a service which basically decide how your metadata service is going to look like. The next one is actual metadata service, which basically takes care of the metadata of your objects cluster, all the buckets that you create, all the data that you're going to upload into the cluster. Now consider this as a Cassandra of your AOS cluster. The job that Cassandra does for the AOS is a similar job metadata server does for the objects. The next service is Atlas. Now Atlas takes care of keeping your cluster healthy. It takes care of garbage collection of the unwanted data, and it does the partial scan and the full scan to make sure that your cluster is always healthy. Consider this as a curator of the AOS cluster. The next service is Object Store Controller. Now this is a service which takes care of your actual IO requests. So this service exposes the S3 endpoint and it does a translation of your S3 request to the actual IO and then talks to the AOS cluster and responds to the user. Consider this service as a Stargate of the objects cluster. The last service is a UI gateway service, which takes care of presenting all the stats, all the information of your backend into the present UI. It takes about 40 to 45 minutes for the cluster deployment. In the next video, we'll go over the actual deployed cluster and what all things we can actually do. I hope you find this video useful. Do let me know if you have any comment or a feedback.